This is the Roots and All podcast, and I'm your host, Sarah Wilson. Join me as I talk about all aspects of gardening with some of the top horticulturists from around the world. Hello and welcome to Roots and All, where I'm speaking with Kevin Hobbs and Artur Cesar-Erlach, authors of Edible, 70 Sustainable Plants That Are Changing How We Eat, which is a beautifully illustrated book looking at edible plants from around the world that are revolutionising how we grow, eat and appreciate food. It tackles important questions like, what do we eat when our usual diets are no longer sustainable? How do we future-proof food? And how can we be more mindful about what we eat? And it considers what the future of global food production might look like.
Well, shall I go first?
Yes, definitely, yes.
So I've worked in predominantly ornamental horticulture all my life, since leaving school and becoming a Hillier nursery apprentice. And I've worked with ornamentals, but also edibles as well, of course, and they're one of the same in so many situations. You know, there's plenty of edibles that are also very ornamental and have a place in the garden. But in the last 10 years or so, I've been more involved in finding unusual edibles to go to market, basically, and indeed part of my salary is paid to do that with that in mind, and obviously it helps traveling around and seeing what other cultures and other countries are doing with their edibles and their fresh produce, as it were. So I felt for some time, wouldn't it be great to actually put that into a book and celebrate these options that we have, many of which are perfectly accessible now. If we work at it, more will become available in the future, and the objective being just to open everyone's minds and eyes to the opportunities out there, and to take on such an undertaking, I needed someone to join me that could describe flavors and the nutrition and the culinary uses of these amazing plants, and that's how I approached Artur. So perhaps Artur would like to explain.
Yeah, no, absolutely. We met actually connected through Instagram of all places. So that was a really interesting start during the first lockdown in Corona. And then we developed, Kevin had the idea to make the book about edible plants. And then we kind of developed it from there together. And I was immediately on board. I think Kevin hasn't even finished asking the sentence when I said yes, definitely, because it's in so many ways up my wheelhouse. I'm really fascinated by the diversity of plants, edible plants out there. I've been focusing quite a bit on trees in the last years. And this amazement of mine is really twofold. The one being for discovering new flavors, new textures, new ingredients even that could be used in gastronomy and beyond. And my other area of interest has always been, diversifying our food system, because today, although if you go into a supermarket, it seems like we have a huge diversity of the food items on offer. In reality, almost 60 or 70% of the products in one of the supermarkets is made from just 4 plants. We as human society are dependent on 4 plants, this being wheat, maize, soy, and rice. Maybe you can, on fifth place, you could also add potatoes. And this is, of course, somewhat of a bottleneck in many cases. And as an ecologist, I always looked into diversifying things. And that's why I was so interested to discover new edible plants, or plants that are already, many of them, which we have in the book, are already feeding millions of people today, but they're just used in certain regions or used very differently. And that's why I was so fascinated by the book, because this way we could show the huge diversity that's out there, which is already feeding many people and could do way more so in the future. And also introduce, many new flavors and really interesting food experiences.
Yeah, so I mean, it is obviously important to think about alternatives. It might seem obvious, but why do you think we ought to be exploring much more widely beyond those 4 or 5 staple crops that we rely on?
The obvious, of course, Sarah, which you were alluding to, is climate change, and it's so complex, the journey of food to our plates, and we all owe it to ourselves and the planet to be better informed about what we're eating and where it's coming from. Now, everyone's got busy lives. You know, I've got a family. I've got a youngster, and we're time limited. But it doesn't take too much effort to tune in to what you're eating and where it's coming from, and to have the opportunity to write a book, thanks to Thames and Hudson, is such a privilege, because it means that we can make it very accessible for people that have busy lives, information that we've researched and we've discovered on our travels around the world, and we can all do our little bit to make a difference to the planet by diversifying what we eat and being better informed about what we are already eating, such as avocados. Is a good example of how they make that journey to our plate, and the pros and cons of these popular new, and I guess you could say avocado is still considered relatively new in this part of the world, where they come from, and the impact they have once they get to our plate.
Did you want to add anything, Artur?
Yeah, definitely. So I think at the moment it's a hugely important topic, diversifying our food system, because we have so many issues at the moment. One, of course, being, as Kevin already mentioned, climate change and all the extreme weather events we are seeing more and more, which are threatening a lot of our food production areas. Then, of course, we have, as an ecologist, it's very important for me to look also into, biodiversity loss, where also our food production has a huge role to play in. And also simply because I think, as this is really because I enjoy food so much, I also think it's very interesting to get new flavor experiences and, many new dishes into what we eat on a daily basis. And kind of the intersection between those three topics really is then our book, because there we search for plants that can really withstand almost any kind of weather. They can thrive in really desert-like areas, or on stormy seashores, or even very cold areas, and still produce tasty food for us. And that is really what we need. We need really, really resilient plants for our future, that can thrive in anything that nature throws at them. And yeah, that's, I think, what we discovered quite a few really fascinating ones.
So you've picked things that are resilient in terms of weather and climate, and obviously you've got 70 plants in the book. How did you narrow those down even further?
That was a very tough job, indeed, and we wanted to give a diversity, across the planet, as it were, of different plant-based foods that could be tried and enjoyed. And we're not saying that all of these will end up in our supermarkets, of course. That we've sought balance there. It's not a foraging book, but there are foraging elements, and reference to what can be foraged. But more importantly, the plants so often that can be foraged could be grown in your garden, or grown in an agroforestry situation. And we just wanted to represent a cross section of plant-based foods, and including macroalgae, or seaweeds as well. So anything that photosynthesizes, basically. But there is a huge list that didn't make it into the book, and we're hoping there'll be a volume 2 and 3 and 4 and so on.
Well, yeah, I mean, that'd be brilliant. And so I've picked out a couple of the plants that people, I think, because people listen to the podcast from around the world, and I've picked out a few of the plants that I think seem to be the most versatile in terms of what they need to grow. And I wondered if we could maybe just run through a few, if you wouldn't mind. I don't know how far we'll get through my list because there were so many fascinating ones, but I've kind of cherry picked a few out. And the first one that I wanted you to tell me about was Hopniss.
Brilliant. Okay. Well, Artur and I have got a nice balance in these situations. I normally talk about the plant, and then of course Artur talks about the uses and the flavors and so on. So Apios americana Hopniss. Well, I've grown this before as an ornamental because it's got a beautiful flower. It's essentially a herbaceous perennial climbing plant, basically. So it goes dormant in the winter, and obviously Fabiaceae family. So it's got a really pretty flower, pinky red flower. There are other color variations, and from an edible point of view, it's a very beneficial plant to grow because it's easy to grow. It takes a while for the roots to build up a decent size that you can enjoy, on your plate. But you've got that bonus of the ornate flowers, and I do need to mention Mandy Barber at Incredible Vegetables here, because she's got a huge collection of Hopniss or Apios americana on her nursery that she grows and makes available for sale, and this plant was very important to indigenous Americans. The Lenape, for example, would often go in and dig them up from wild areas. They grow quite often along rivers and streams in kind of wooded areas, in damp areas, and the Lenape would gently lift them, not completely remove them. Lift a proportion of the plant and then replant them in kind of semi-natural kind of wooded areas near their settlements. In other words, they weren't purely farming them; they were actually just relocating them a little closer to their settlements, which of course often moved every year or every few years. So that helped spread the plant around in a quite a natural way in many respects, but it was a staple for such indigenous Americans.
Okay, and Artur, did you want to add anything about the taste or the uses of it?
Yes, absolutely. I think the Hopniss is really a plant that has it all. On the one hand, it produces peas. On the other hand, or seeds that are pea-like. On the other hand, it produces roots or tubers, edible ones, and then of course you can also eat the young shoots and the flowers of this plant. And all while producing all of this bounty of food, it also fixes nitrogen into the soil, so it even improves the soil. The seeds have a pea-like flavor and also look like peas, whereas the roots, the tubers, are used mostly like potatoes, but have this kind of starchy sweetness of potatoes combined somewhere in the areas of sweet potatoes and maybe also peanuts. So it has a very interesting flavor, and it can, since it has a climbing habit, it can grow on forest edges, or which makes it perfect in agroforestry systems because it takes up very little space since it climbs up and can be integrated very easily into those systems.
It sounds very tempting, I have to say. I may well need to track that one down. And the other one that caught my attention was great burdock.
Yes, good old great burdock, Arxium lapa. That's one that will be familiar to many. It's one of the most successful pioneer plants. It's believed to have originated in Eurasia, but it's become a circumpolar pioneer of temperate regions. So it's often found. It's very common in the UK and continental Europe. Often grown found growing in along roadsides and verges and wasteland and so on. and in the Middle Ages, this it was a staple part of the diet. It was commonplace, and obviously, more modern introduced root vegetables kind of replaced it ultimately. But it's crazy because it's actually really, really tasty, and I'll let Artur get into that. But it's ubiquitous in Japan, for example. I do a lot of business in Japan, and it's known as gobo there, and every supermarket you can buy pickled gobo or burdock as we know it, or packaged, shrink wrap packaged roots, preserved. It's an everyday vegetable there, and very tasty too. But of course, it's something you can forage, and it's essentially a biennial. So in the first year, as it's putting its root down and building a crown, if you harvest it towards later in the summer, in that first year, that's when it's sweetest and best eaten. The second year, when it's starting to prepare for flower, it gets a little bit more woody and fibrous. But it's one, of course, you can easily grow at home anyway. You don't have to forage. You can go and collect the seeds. The seeds are the classic. It's Asteraceae. You've got the kind of purple thistly looking flower, but the seeds are those burrs. In fact, I think it's 1941, Velcro, the invention of Velcro, happened, and that was based on the burrs of Arctium lapa, burdock.
Amazing. Artur, how does it taste?
So you can eat quite several parts of the plant. The first, or the major part, of course, being the roots in the first year. And they have a very interesting taste, which maybe goes into the direction of a combination between artichoke and bamboo shoots, if you ever had the chance to try those two things. And it can be also used as a source for a sweetener, which can be also used by diabetics. And then, of course, those annoying seeds or burrs for anyone that has a dog. You could also collect them and sprout them and also eat them, while also the young stems and shoots can be eaten. So almost everything from this plant can be eaten. It's very tasty. And it's a great example of a plant which is generally considered, to be a nuisance, because it can grow anywhere in almost any condition. But that is exactly what we're looking for now, because it can grow without much human intervention and produces a really bounty crop, and that this every year, and is used in many countries around the world already today.
It's so fascinating reading your book and considering our food plants that we use, because you do have to wonder why some of these things that are so abundant just don't get used more often, or why they fell out of favour. But I've got actually 3 more plants, but I might let you pick which one you like to speak about. I had Cornelian cherry, Ebbing silverberry, and sea buckthorn. And which one of those would you like to fill us in on?
I don't know about Artur, but the Elaeagnus, the Ebbing silverberry, I think is very accessible, to a lot of listeners wherever they may be. What do you think, Artur?
Yes, definitely. I was going for the same one.
Excellent. So, having grown, ornamentals all these years, amongst which is the genus Elaeagnus, often known as Ebbing silverberry. It's been known to me for a very long time that the fruits are edible. But what's interesting, what I have seen over the last 30 years or so, is a growing interest in them as an edible fruit, and a growing awareness, and indeed selections being made that are more tasty and larger fruit, more flesh to enjoy. And there's Elaeagnus X submacrophylla, which is a commonly available Elaeagnus that is grown in horticulture for mainly hedging, to be fair, and it's very common in around car parks of shopping malls and superstores and so on and so forth. and it kind of is an unsung hero, really, because it's evergreen, and is very tolerant of different conditions, which Artur will explain. But also in autumn, in fact now, it has very small, creamy white flowers that are highly scented, and it's always amused me because the flowers are somewhat hidden amongst the foliage. And I have noticed people over the years picking up on the scent in the breeze and being completely perplexed as to where the scent is coming, because it's not immediately obvious until you actually get closer to the plant and have a look. But the good thing about Elaeagnus submacrophylla, and it used to be Elaeagnus ex Ebbingii, by the way, the taxonomists have made an adjustment there. It flowers in late summer, autumn, and then when you get into, depending on your climate, when you get into March time, February, March, April, the fruits start to ripen. So here in the south of England, I was eating the fruit in April time, and it's a fruit, like so many fruits, that is astringent if you pick them too soon. So, you might say, well, what on earth was Kevin talking about? I tasted one and it was pretty unpleasant. You have to wait for them to become fully ripe, and it's fairly obvious because they go through obviously green to an orangey red to red, and then a dark red. And once they get to that dark red, they're very tasty indeed. And there's been many selections made over the years that are grown specifically for being edible. And the beauty of Elaeagnus is a pretty widespread genus. So if you're in North America, you've got Commutata, and there's also multiflora, which I've enjoyed in Japan. That's one of the most productive species, and that's typically eaten. It's relatively common to be enjoyed as a fruit, and you can buy the fruit indeed, and products made from the fruit in East Asia. And then there's umbellata, which people often call the autumn olive. I'm a bit perplexed why the common name is autumn olive. It doesn't look like an olive. I guess the silvery foliage perhaps is slightly reminiscent of an olive tree. But the great thing about umbellata is, as Artur and I discovered ourselves about 3 weeks ago in the Sir Howard Hillier gardens, we were enjoying the fruit of umbellata then. So you've got spring fruiting Elaeagnus and autumn fruiting Elaeagnus, and they're plants that are very easy to grow. So over to Artur for further explanation.
Yeah, I'm actually so happy that we chose this plant, because I got to know it in this sense through Kevin actually, and ever since I've been researching it and trying it and tasting it, I've also planted it, several of them, in my garden, especially in patches of my hedge where still where there still were like open spaces, because it grows really well also in shade, and is very resistant to almost any kind of soil condition, and also salt spray along the coastline. So it's a really resilient plant at that. And then of course the fragrant flowers that Kevin already mentions that it produces in autumn can be used to flavor many desserts, especially milk-based desserts are really great with it. And then once the fruits are ripe in early spring or in spring, they can be used in so many ways. Of course, the classic ways where you would use fruits like jams and jellies and syrups and juices like this. But then also in fruit ladders or even in savory dishes, they're really perfect, or to make sodas. So it's a really tasty plant that is evergreen, which is also maybe something that's really worth mentioning. And I'm really happy that I discovered it through the process of writing Edible together with Kevin.
Yeah, it sounds amazing, and like you say, really easy to grow. So definitely a bit of a no-brainer, that one. And kind of in that vein, I'm going to get you each to pick, as your final question, if you can, and I know it's going to be a very difficult question, but what would be your most underutilized crop, in your opinion, that you cover in the book?
Wow, that's a really, really tough question. My example would be perhaps nutmeg being a little more international. I'm fascinated by the nutmeg tree, Myristica fragrans, from the islands of Indonesia, Maluku, because listeners will know nutmeg as a spice, of course, and that comes from the seed or the stone of the fruit. And then you've got mace, which is the beautiful aril. Well, hopefully people will purchase the book and they'll see for themselves from Katie Cooler's amazing illustrations, and you'll see the aril. But it's definitely worth looking up. It's very striking. The seed is black when first the fruit is open, and it's covered by a very scarlet red aril, a regular net-like aril, and that's what makes the spice mace. So you've already got two food crops from this tree, and what Artur and I wanted to promote is actually the fruit that encloses the aril and the seed, which is about 80% of its weight actually is being used in very interesting ways, and I'll let Artur explain that in a moment. So it's really about making the best of every attribute of plants such as this.
Quite. Well, I mean, Artur, same question to you.
So what immediately came to mind for me today was actually sweet potato leaves, because, we all know and probably love sweet potatoes, but we hardly ever consider that the leaves are perfectly edible from sweet potatoes. And the really fascinating thing about it is that they can be harvested several times a year, which is actually done in many countries around the world, for example, being Tanzania in Africa. And the leaves itself, can be eaten raw, which is slightly bitter taste, or can be used like spinach, so cooked or sauteed in many dishes and varieties. And for me, that's a perfect example of, that we use our resources more wisely, or fully for that matter, that we really use every part of the plants that we grow or that we harvest. And that for me was an absolute perfect example.
Many thanks to Kevin and Artur for talking about their fascinating work, and thank you to you for listening. This week's shout out to good people doing good work goes to, and I'm hoping I haven't mentioned this person before because I've got a brain like a sieve, and it's quite possible. Anyway, it's Lucy Weldon, who is a talented author, a very clever and thoughtful life coach, and also a wildlife gardening advocate. I encourage you to check out both her book and her coaching website if you're in need of guidance, and of course, I've put the links in the show notes. Dr. Ian Bedford is up next, talking about a group of bugs that quite often hitch a lift on you as you work in the autumn borders.
Autumn is the time of year when an important group of invertebrates, the arachnids, become increasingly more noticeable to us, since many species, particularly those with a yearly life cycle, will have become fully grown adults. And the pervasiveness of the most well-known taxonomic group of arachnids within our gardens will be revealed on autumnal mornings by the dew as it glistens on webs and countless layers of silken threads that the spiders trail across the plants and surfaces. But less obvious will be the many species of arachnids that don't produce silk. The ground-dwelling mites, ticks, and in warmer parts of Britain, even scorpions. But also an order of arachnids called the Opilions, which are more commonly known to us as the Harvestmen. Harvestmen, of which there's around 25 species in Britain, are relatively common, and although they can be seen throughout the year in a variety of habitats, they're most likely to be found during autumn and around harvest time. But without close inspection, Harvestmen could easily be mistaken for cellar spiders, the daddy long-legged spiders that we often find lurking in dark corners or behind the furniture within our homes. Since just like the cellar spiders, most Harvestmen have 8 long spindly legs and a small round body. But unlike the spiders, they don't have a waist, they don't produce webs, and they're not venomous. They do, however, have 2 eyes on a raised structure on their backs, and 2 large fangs that protrude from their heads, and hooks at the end of their legs that they use to catch their prey, which includes a wide variety of other invertebrates, including spiders, slugs, and even small snails. They also have an effective defence strategy, for which they readily shed a few legs if caught by a predator, and then secrete a foul-smelling liquid to deter them from being eaten. So the Harvestmen are quite a unique and interesting group of invertebrates that often go unnoticed within our gardens, but are well worth keeping an eye open for.
You can download or listen to the podcast direct from the website rootsandall.co.uk. Please also check out my Patreon, where you can make a one-off donation or take out a monthly subscription to help support the podcast. Because if you enjoy the show, please help it continue. I also have a GoFundMe where you can make a one-off donation. Even a one-off donation of £1 helps, and I'll be really grateful for your support. So please go to Patreon or GoFundMe and search for Roots and All Podcast.